Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming out here today and listening to our talk. And if you're dialing in remotely, welcome to Virtual Mountain View. Today, we're going to be talking about how material design can be adopted and measured for product success. So my name is Michael Gilbert, and I'm currently the research lead for the material design system, which includes things like codes and components.
Hi, and my name is Clara Kliman-Silver, and I'm the research lead for material tools, which includes things like gallery.
So, before we get started, a little bit about what we're going to cover today. I think one challenge that we probably all have in this room is how to measure the value of a system on your teams. And in fact, some of our research has actually showed that what works for one team, of course, doesn't always work for every other team. So what we're going to share are a set of strategies and methods that can help to implement and measure the value of a design system. For instance, one of the things that we learned are that there are certain conversations that teams often skip entirely when they're adopting a design system. And when they fail to have these conversations, sometimes they find it difficult to measure the impact of adoption later on, to know what was helpful and what wasn't. So what we're going to do here is provide some suggestions on techniques that you can try, highlighting some of the data that you can collect and some of the conversations that you may want to have as you implement and measure the value of adoption. So with that, let's first cover what material design is, if you're not already familiar with it, and why it's valuable for designers and developers. After that, we're going to cover a little bit about how you might understand and measure that value on your own teams, specifically focusing on some of the benefits you can expect from adopting a design system. And then throughout, we're going to share some of our own findings on how material has impacted teams here at Google. So first, what material is. Material design is an open source, adaptable design system that helps you build high-quality digital experiences for your users. Basically, material helps you build beautiful, usable, useful products easier. More specifically, though, material is a set of three things. First, it's a set of components that allow you to build products with complex interactions baked in right from the start, where you get things like usability, accessibility, and motion for free. Second, it's a set of patterns and guidelines that make sure that you're using those components that work for no matter what platform you're building on, whether it's Android, iOS, web, or even Flutter. And then third, material is a set of tools that provide a well-lit path toward using those components and those patterns in your own teams for your own products. But design systems didn't start with material. Systems of design actually have a longer history. And basically what we can say is that design systems are an evolution of patterns. And those patterns have taken many shapes through history. There's something called pattern languages that were actually first sort of brought out in the 1970s, first in the field of architecture and then more recently in lots of other fields, including human-computer interaction. There's coding patterns, which if you're a developer or engineer in the room, you're probably already pretty familiar with. And then even artistic movements have their own patterns that sort of get created and then followed as different sessions kind of push forward. So for each of these, how we approach them isn't that different. In a way, you probably know when the organization of a room, a living room or a kitchen, for instance, when it feels wrong, when you can't find anything, when everything is out of place, and no matter what you do, you can't seem to find a ladle. In the same way, you also probably know when a piece of code feels wrong, when it doesn't read easily, when it isn't structured well. And finally, in the same way, you probably already know when a new app feels wrong, when the design is surprising in a bad way, or the interaction just feels clumsy. And for each of these, one of the reasons they may not feel right is because they break from established systems of good design. So let's just take one of those examples, pattern languages, which, as I mentioned, were created back in the 70s. So these patterns, these pattern languages, allowed you to build your own systems for design, covering everything from the layout of towns in a countryside to how to best light a cozy room. And looking at just one of these, pattern 114, the hierarchy of open space, we can see how simple patterns can make big changes. For this pattern, the rationale is pretty simple, that given the choice, people rarely sit just facing a brick wall. They'll probably sit with the wall at their back and they'll face the open space in front of them. But what that actually means is that when you actually look at this recursively, you can come up with some pretty complex interactions. To illustrate that, take a look first at a picture of a relatively small space. Picture yourself in a garden with a bench with a back, and you're looking out over flowers in front of you. And then that same pattern can also be applied to a larger space. Say, picture looking out over a street. And then that same pattern again can be applied to even larger spaces. For instance, here looking out over the center of a town. And the point is, in the same way that an app can be built from a set of nested patterns, so can a city. And when you look at an open space that's nested inside an open space, you can see how even simple patterns, one simple rule, can be constructed to form really complex things. And you can feel when the principle of this system is flowing in the right way. So it's true that design systems have a pretty long history, but for today we're going to define it as a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. And what I'd like to emphasize here is that a design system, similar to material, doesn't dictate exactly what your product should look like or exactly what it should do. You don't have to use every single component or every pattern, maybe just the ones that actually apply to your product. You basically get to create your own system of design, very similar to pattern languages. And by creating your own system, creating your own theme, you create a product that is more usable, that is more intuitively comfortable, and importantly, most uniquely your own. But what does that look like in practice? So here we have an example of what the breadth of variety you can get from material theming. And again, material doesn't dictate what the experiences look like or exactly what they do. It just ensures that those experiences are usable, that they're beautiful, and again, that they feel right. And if you want to play around with this idea a little bit more, you can actually swing by the Material Design and Accessibility Sandbox later on, where you can test out material theming and even print out your own sticker sheets. So now that we've covered material, let's jump to value. Because what we're talking about here isn't just about adopting a tool or a process to add value. It's about being able to realize that you have value within your teams in the first place. So in this section, we're going to introduce what we mean when we talk about value and let you know why that's important for your own teams. So when we say value, you may be thinking about something like this, a graph that shows the commits, the issues, and the rate of commits for your product. But there's a big difference between value and velocity, or what the rate of development actually is. And it's true that value can add to velocity. And it's also true that velocity is a measure of value. But velocity alone isn't sufficient to realize value. You'll also want to identify both the social and emotional aspects of that within your own teams. Because if you can build really quickly, but your team is just burned out, is it really worth it, you have to ask? Or if you can build really quickly, but no one really seems to like the product, is it worth it? We'll come back to this a little bit more later, but for now, let's show what value is. So when we talk about value, we actually mean something pretty specific. We did an entire research study just on this subject, and we found when teams talk about value, they frequently bring up two different things. Process, or things that are related to speed, efficiency, and clarity, and then product, things that are related to consistency and usability, things that are very commonly filed under product excellence. But the research actually also revealed two additional dimensions of value that are equally important. One of those new dimensions is team health, or how a system relates to relationships and alignment. And for instance, one of our research participants told us that after adopting material design, teams spent less time churning and debating decisions, which made team interactions just feel more pleasant. And the final dimension of value is job satisfaction, or how that system relates to things like confidence, well-being, and personal growth. And since two of those may be a little bit new, I'll give an example for both of them. So there are many aspects to team health, of course, but prior research here at Google has actually identified 5 dimensions that are key to healthy operating teams, and they're shown here. And if you want to look these up, the URL is actually rework.withgoogle.com. These dimensions include, right at the top, number 1, psychological safety. And this is the degree to which you feel comfortable taking risks or being vulnerable in front of your teammates. Dependability under that is the degree to which you can actually count on your team to get things done and get them done right. Then structure and clarity, the extent to which you can actually understand the norms and the values on your team. Followed by meaning, the degree to which you feel that your work is personally important on your team, and then impact, the degree to which that work is important outside your team as well. And it's worth noting that these are actually numbered by the importance given this prior research. So psychological safety was actually found to be the single most important aspect to healthy operating teams. And last, I think most of us have a pretty implicit understanding of what something like job satisfaction means, but for the sake of this, we can just break it down to 3 questions. First, can you choose your job? Do you have the autonomy, the ability to select the thing that you do? Second is the issue of ability. Can you do your job? And this isn't just whether or not your own ability to do the job, but can you pull in the tools necessary to get the job done? And then third is the issue of reward. Is the thing that you do on a day-to-day basis the thing that you're actually rewarded for in your job? So to recap, having a design system can do a lot of things. It can make your work more efficient. It can make your products better. It can make your team healthier. And it can improve job satisfaction. But you don't have to take our word for it. Coming up, we're going to show you a few examples to show how you might identify and measure these dimensions of value in your own products. So with that, I'll hand you off to Clara, who's going to take you through it.
Thank you, Michael. So in this next section, we're going to talk about 5 places in the product development lifecycle where you can measure value in your design system. We'll call these stages for measuring value. And in each stage, we'll cover opportunities for instrumenting data to measure value. Specifically, we'll talk about 3 things. First, the ideal, or what you might hope to encounter if everything is running 100% smoothly. It goes without saying that this is difficult, and in fact, perhaps pretty rare. As Kurt Vonnegut said, this is the world in which everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. After the ideal, we'll introduce the reality, or what you might hope to find in the average organization. And then lastly, we'll introduce some strategies or opportunities to close the gap between the ideal and the reality. Now, some of these strategies may be more quantitative in nature, such as a survey or looking at log data, whereas others may be more qualitative, such as a team discussion or some kind of workshop. So let's begin with the first stage, or preconditions for measuring value. In order to measure value, there will need to be specific measures instrumented into a product or process that will allow you to collect data. But there's a very important initial step that needs to be taken. The measurement plan should be clear, it should be articulate, and it needs to be agreed upon by your stakeholders, your team leads, your product managers, even your senior managers, in order to be successful. So let's go to this ideal world. In this ideal world, everything is going really well. Senior management is so excited about measuring the impact of your design system that they've staffed the right people to help you do that, and those people, in turn, are thrilled about measuring the impact of your design. You have all the tools that you need to get started, and everything is in alignment on which data needs to be collected. Does that sound familiar to anyone here? OK. So as many of you know, we don't actually live in this ideal world. In fact, this scenario may be more realistic to you. Maybe you're behind on features you hope to launch last quarter, and no one on your team has time to instrument the data collection, however important they feel it is. Moreover, everyone has a different view on what needs to be measured and why, and you don't have the tools and the infrastructure you need to do so. So when you have this delta between the ideal and the reality, what can you do about it? One thing to do, if you do one thing, is conduct a strategy audit. Get together with your team and discuss what is the problem and what are you hoping to achieve. Talk about the value that you hope to identify and the expected insights that you hope to derive from that value. And as you do this, think about establishing your baseline. Where are you in relation to that goal? And even if you're far away, there needs to be a starting place. As you start to instrument data collection, you can compare your progress to this baseline. And as you do this, discuss how you and your teammates can empower one another to succeed. As Michael said, psychological safety is important, and this is a social process, a group effort. We asked some Google designers about their experiences, and one of them told us, it's more important to build the right thing than to build the thing right. Ideally, of course, you're doing both. You're building the right thing and building it the right way. But what they're saying is that given the choice, they would rather be solving the right problem than be solving the wrong problem the right way. And these strategies that we're sharing are potential ways to get there. So now let's talk about the design tools that you're using to build your product. Design tools are sometimes considered agents for implementing a design system rather than a part of the system itself. However, as Michael noted earlier, we believe that tools are very much part of the system. The tools that you use to design help or hinder the adoption of a design system and the ability to design and develop harmoniously as a team. And understanding how this applies to your organization can be helpful when measuring impact. So to return to our ideal world, let's imagine that your budget for tools is limitless. You use your favorite programs, and so do your teammates. And somehow, magically, everything works, despite incompatible file types and operating systems. You sit in 5 different offices in 5 different time zones, but perfect version control and fantastic video conferencing technology make collaboration a breeze. But perhaps in reality, things are a bit different. You're running up against tight deadlines, and your design tools are making your process take forever. More often than not, you're not using the tools that you want to use, but instead the tools that your team or your organization says you have to use. And there are a lot of them. So one thing to do in this situation is conduct a tool audit. Ask your team to list out which tools you're using and why. We learned in our research that processes are sometimes fractured across a large number of tools, and not everyone on the team knows what's in play. As you do this, ask your team what's missing from your toolbox and what's being duplicated. Do you have tools that are doing the same thing? And also discuss the impact of your tools on your team health and your business goals. How do your tools affect your team today, your collaboration? And how will these tools scale as your organization grows and your product changes? How many of you have done an audit like this? OK, so there are a lot of ways to go about it, but one way is to create a simple chart, such as this one. List out the tools that you're using, who's using them. Is it just a designer? Is it all your designers, some developers, everyone? And what is it used for? Does it perform a single task, or is it used continually across many? Also take the time to note the pros and cons. What's working about each tool, and what's failing you? You'll end up with a list of everything that you're using across your design and development process, and you can use this information to understand the value that your tools bring. We talked to a Google designer, and they told us The least amount of tools my teammates have to look at, the better. We heard this sentiment often in our research. More tools generally, though not always, means more pain, especially if multiple tools are used to accomplish the same task. So now let's talk about the context in which you're operating. When we say context, what we mean is that in order for your team to identify and measure the value that any system or tool will have on your product, it's important to understand the players that will be using that system or tool. It's important to understand what are their opinions, their frictions, their deeply held beliefs. Essentially, you're building empathy for one another and understanding where you're coming from and how to work effectively as a team. And it goes without saying, of course, that it's also important to understand your end users and how the adoption of your tool or system will ultimately affect them. In an ideal world, this is abundantly clear. The work that you need to do to get promoted is the same work that's needed to ensure that your product succeeds. And because of this, everyone is on the same page, driving development forward, and they feel good about it. But in reality, it may be less clear. The work that's required to get a system or process or tool successfully off the ground is often on top of all the other work that needs to be done. And you're moving quickly, not allowing for the types of awareness or consensus building necessary to make sure that these tools or processes are successfully integrated and adopted. As a result, it's much harder to make sure that the work that needs to be done is the work that's getting prioritized. So one thing to do is conduct a user audit. Understand who will be affected by your process or tool or system changes. And when we say users, we are talking about two groups. We're talking about your team, who's working with the system or tool, but we're also talking about your end users, who will eventually feel the effects when they use your product. What you end up doing is ultimately up to you and the resources that you have available, but it's helpful to be doing it on a regular basis to create consistent measures over time. It could be a quarterly survey that asks a set of qualitative and quantitative questions about team health and process. It might be a series of interviews that you run periodically, either with your end users or your team. And as you do this, think about what issues might arise. How will you measure friction? How will you evaluate success? If you're doing this regularly, you'll be able to see a snapshot of your team's and your users' current thinking, and also how that thinking changes over time. For instance, we heard from one participant, we still haven't adopted this tool. We're waiting for engineering and product management to prioritize it. The point here is to emphasize that the factors that affect your team's successful adoption of material design, or any tool, most tooling that is often not related to that system or tool itself. In fact, much of the time, the biggest hurdles that teams have in successfully integrating a process or tool into their own team are things such as existing infrastructure, organizational support and resources, and conflicting tools, systems, and processes. So the point is that it's important to understand the context in which your team is operating, especially when the hurdles to adoption may not be related to the system or tool itself. So let's talk about process and execution. And when we say process and execution, we mean not only how designers and developers create products, but also the work required to integrate the design system and tooling into their existing workflows. In an ideal world, everyone agrees on the process. You documented and defined one roadmap at the beginning of the year, and everyone stuck to it. Programs are sufficiently staffed to carry it out. And it's easy to map existing projects onto new tools and processes. And everyone's really excited about doing that work. But in reality, priorities are changing on a regular basis, perhaps monthly or even weekly. You don't have the budget to do what you set out to, and migrating to new systems and tools may not be easy. Teams can spend months or even years adjusting to new systems, taking care of design and engineering work required to implement new components, and getting used to new design and development environments. So one thing to do in this situation is conduct a process audit. We spoke earlier about the value of reviewing your tools. You can consider trying a similar activity with your team's process, both how things actually get done and how success is measured. And as you do this, think about the following questions. What is your team trying to optimize for? Individual excellence or product evolution? Take a look at current processes in flight. What's working and what isn't? And as your organization changes, how can you make sure that what's working scales? You can consider running this audit as a team workshop to understand your process as a group. You can use Post-it notes to mark out phases of your team's process and note what each of you are doing as you move through your design and development cycles. Also take note of what's working and what isn't, what's frustrating to you. Then you'll have a map of your process, and you'll know what areas are successful and where to improve. But this is also a time to start thinking about the quantitative data. You can talk about velocity, for instance. Look at your logs, perhaps using a graph like the one that Michael showed earlier. Where are the commits and where are the issues? How is the design system helping or hindering your process? This is to say that measuring process is both a qualitative and a quantitative endeavor. So our final stage is reflection, an iterative phase. At this point, you've probably already gone through most of the steps towards adopting material design or integrating a new tool or system into your workflow. Now is the time to think about what went well and what needs to be refined. You can look at all the data you've collected throughout the process to see what's next. But what I think is important to call out here is that it's not unusual for teams to reach this phase and look at data for the first time. It's also not unusual for teams to get to this point and realize they don't have any data because they didn't do any of the earlier steps or something similar. So clearly, in the ideal world, you have received the support you need, you did instrument data collection, and as a result, you're able to identify the impact of instrumentation and your design system. And then you get a promotion for your hard work, job satisfaction. Does that sound familiar to anyone here? But in reality, you didn't have a support. Maybe you didn't set up data instrumentation. And as a result, major product decisions were potentially made without the ability to evaluate their impact on the product. And the point that I want to emphasize here is that even if this is your situation, it is really never too late to enact some kind of measure that will enable you to identify the value of your system, find a value that's already there, or push towards a new value. So one thing to do here is to be iterative, keep collecting data. And when we say data, we mean all kinds of data. Team health, process, impact on end users, velocity of adoption, velocity of creation. Understanding your team and your users, though, is not something to do only once. You can enact continual measures over time that allow you to get a better sense of your audience. And for both your team and your end users, it's important to understand what they want, not just what they do. It's great to use log data to identify whether your users are able to successfully complete the certain types of tasks that your product allows for, or that your team is able to work with a certain velocity. But it's also useful to collect qualitative data to make sure that the tasks that your users or your team are doing are valuable and interesting and useful to them. It's what they want. And also note that you don't have to collect all the data at once. You can begin with something simple, perhaps some informal discussions with your teams and an audit of your tools and processes, and then add in surveys or qualitative interviews or something more formal as you go on. It's also worth taking the time to reflect on how you're collecting data, what you're learning from it, and how it's helping you. Which brings me to a discussion point for your team. Will your data allow you to keep up or get ahead? What will you be doing with it? So in sum, we covered 5 phases of the design development cycle. And we covered preconditions for measuring value, tools, your team's context, process and evolution, and finally the iterative phase, reflection. These stages are illustrative, but not exhaustive. That what we're setting out here, in the same spirit of material design, is a framework of considerations as you develop your own pipeline to measure value within your product or your team. So now I'd like to hand it back to Michael, who will bring this all together.
All right. Thank you very much. So one last thing before we wrap everything up. Now that we've covered all the basics, we're all on the same page, we're going to focus on a couple more concrete examples. So on the left of this slide, we have our 4 dimensions of value that we introduced earlier. And then on the right, we have the 5 stages to actually instrument value within your product lifecycle. And what's important here is that we're not suggesting that any individual stage is where you actually have to instrument value, or that value only goes in one of these stages. What we want you to take away is that you can impact all those dimensions of value at each stage of your product's lifecycle. The instrumenting value into the organization is actually a holistic process that happens throughout. So one specific example, we can start with the value dimension of process, for instance. Consider how the dimension of process might be identified and measured during the preconditions stage, when you're focusing on things like planning and team buy-in, when you're focusing on understanding. And remember the strategy that Clara outlined for preconditions. Number 1, complete a strategy audit or establish a baseline. So by completing an audit, you create an artifact to better communicate your strategy, to get the buy-in you actually need to succeed. Or in other words, you do 3 things. It means you identify an opportunity to increase value, you create artifacts to communicate that value, and then within those artifacts, you can embed a way to measure that value. So just one more focusing on job satisfaction and thinking about how that actually could be measured and identified during the execution stage. So remember when the main strategy for execution was conduct a process audit. And consider how a process audit might actually influence execution with regard to job satisfaction. I think the connection can be pretty clear, that by ensuring individual work aligns with business goals, you're also increasing the opportunity for your colleagues to be able to ensure that their work is appreciated, that they're rewarded for the work that's necessary to actually keep a product together, to keep things moving forward. Sometimes this is called the glue work. And once again, like the first example, the goal here is to identify first an opportunity to create value. After that, number 2, you create an artifact to communicate that value. And in this case, that maybe means codifying that glue work as something that can be valued and rewarded. And then number 3, within that artifact is a way to measure that value. Again, in this case, the example could be making sure that acknowledgement or rewards occur for doing glue work, or where they don't, you can identify that and maybe fix it. The point being, value starts with just being able to identify these types of opportunities. And what we want to be clear on here is that every product is different, and that while these differences actually mean the shape of development is unique to every single product, as we can see in the examples here, there are still common strategies we can use to identify, to realize, and to measure value for each one of these products. So what we're suggesting is that if you consider the dimensions of value that we've highlighted, and you do so throughout the development of the product, you'll have the chance to instrument your process to realize that value. So in the end, we hope that you'll remember just these 5 things, these 5 primary strategies that Clara highlighted earlier. Exactly how you implement them may change given the nature of your product or the nature of your team. The strategy audit, again, number 1, can be as simple as a survey. It can be a workshop or a discussion even that you have with your team to make sure that there's a clear vision in place. A tool audit can be a short survey or a landscape analysis of tools where you can actually identify the things that are being used, and then also the things that people are using that maybe aren't the sanctioned tools. A user audit, number 3, can be a combination of logs analyses. It can be surveys or qualitative work to make sure that you actually understand both the users of your product as well as the team who's developing it. Number 4, a process audit can be where you track things like commits, issues, and bugs, where you focus on things like velocity. And of course, when you iterate, number 5, you give yourself the opportunity to reflect, to change, and to improve wherever you can, given the findings from each of these. So by doing each of these throughout the development of your product again, you'll be able to identify the impact of adopting something like a design system, like material design. You'll be able to see how each of those dimensions of value can change throughout your product's life cycle. And because, remember, every product is different, and every team is different. But by instrumenting each of these measures throughout the life cycle, you can be sensitive to those differences. And you can use material adoption as an opportunity to identify where your team's values actually are. And of course, you'll be able to act on those measurements as well to make sure that you're always improving your product and improving your process, and importantly, of course, always improving your team. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and thank everyone for joining us here today. I'd also like to thank Clara for presenting, and a huge thanks to our colleague, Elisa Weinstein, who's over here, who helped us with some of the framing in this presentation. Thank you very much.